Right. So, whenever I read a history book, this is Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror. Um, it takes me a lot longer than fiction that I enjoy. Some fiction that I don't enjoy might not buzz away uh, so quickly either. If you recall, Heart of Europe, like I think that took me 4 or 5 years, but I read other things in between and whatnot. This I've been reading largely straight through, but it's just harder for me to get sort of hooked into a history the way I used to. I don't know why. Um, I have a history with this book, actually. I tended to confuse it with something else, which is somewhat similar but is actually a fictional book. The Cornerstone by Zoe Oldenburg, I believe. Uh, and I remember getting into a discussion where this one was mentioned, and I had conflated the two, and I was like, "Wait, isn't that a fiction?" Um, and then I figured out, what it actually was. What's odd is they're not based on the same character. Um, this book takes a look at the 14th century, but it really kind of focuses in. Well, first of all, it's almost. Yeah, I don't want to say that, but it's got a definite leaning towards the French and English, the Hundred Years' War, and but it focuses in on Enguerrand the Seventh de Coucy, whom we just happen to have a great deal of information about, um, although not a portrait from the time, and is Fosson, I think is how it's pronounced, apparently uh, wrote both prior to, but also, I think, as sort of, you know, a member of his court or whatever. So there's comparatively, a great deal of information about him as someone who's not, uh, a royal, especially a king or whatever. We have a lot of information about kings and queens and whatnot, and the author actually goes into some kind of, you know sort of effort to make that sound like it was an especially good thing. I don't know that it terribly is. It's a nice focus point. There's no question about that. But I think focusing on one of the royals would have been fine as well. Because we're not. One of the things that she points out, or tries to make an argument for, is that this is kind of an everyman almost. Well, her argument for him being an everyman is that he's not royal and he's not a peasant. He's somewhere in between. Obviously, the vast majority of people are going to be peasants or tradesmen or whatever, rather than nobles. But even within the noble hierarchy, this is a significant player. I mean, yes, he does. I think when he was born, he doesn't have a title of great significance. He ends up becoming a count. Um, but one of the big deals about his family was not having one of those, great noble titles, just being a baron, basically, but a very, very powerful one, with a significant holding, to the extent that, you know, he's one of the powers in France. Anyway, uh, the story actually starts before his life, and it very briefly scratches after, but it goes into some significant detail about the beginnings of the Hundred Years' War, and ranges you through Poitiers and Crécy. Uh, there's a lens to it all that to some extent it's kind of hard to dispute this, right? But on the other hand, it feels like there's something in me that says, yes, but it had to have worked somewhat, which is the argument that basically the chivalric ideals of honor and whatnot taking place at the head of the army. Uh, and being in the forefront of the attack and the reckless attack, and not you know not relying on the common soldiers, but rather holding a disdain for them. That all of that kind of thing was a big part of the problem for the French. And in a way, this is canon, but there's something in me that just finds this very, very hard to accept, simply because systems that are just at heart ineffectual across the board don't actually work. Like they don't last. And the truth of the matter is, this sort of chivalric folly, if you take the author's view of it, um, leads to Poitiers and Crécy. But then over 100 years later, it leads to Agincourt too. It's the same kind of thing, this vainglorious type of reaction. Now, my feeling is that it's more likely that that's a system that did work and did work at times, but all of the major battles seem to support her point of view, and it's really hard to like try to argue a point just from the reason idea that, yeah, but you know how could this keep going? How can you do this? How can you fight this way? Um, and I mean, it's not just against the English. Similar failures show up against the Turks at the very end of Decousy's life, and indeed he dies in Turkish imprisonment. Um, anyway, that's one of the things that I have kind of I would want, if I were a historian, I would be digging deeper as to why is this obvious weakness in sort of the French system of warfare, why does it persist? And what advantages does it give? Because it has to give something. Maybe to the people who are endeavoring in this style of warfare uh, that is so unable to deal with the English problem. I feel like there's a piece of the story that's just missing in this. And again, it's taking this sort of one-sided view. Another point, though, is that the kings who expected great things, and nobles who set up these grand adventures and whatnot, had a tendency not to really deal with the logistics and the down to the brass tacks of it, and that actually applies to both the French and English. Now, Um, where you're going to see that work better is with Henry V, is that he actually operates a little bit better. And he inherits what's the beginning of a nation state there. Uh, sort of, kind of. I mean, the War of the Roses still hasn't happened, or Wars of the Roses still haven't happened. But you're seeing these glimmerings of, like, state action. Not that the book covers any of that. Uh, happening at that point, and actually much more the idea of sort of nationalism coming to the French at the end of the past Decousy's life in terms of Joan of Arc, and that being sort of the solution to their problems. The writing is good. It's not the kind of thing that I feel like just drawn to, hey, I need to see what happens next or whatever. That's just me, Like I said, histories don't tend to do that. I saw some commentation on or commenters on a podcast that I watch or listen to or whatever it is, who kind of complained about her history in her Guns of August about World War One. And I mean, again, with a combination of the era that it's from, that it's a popularization of history, so it, isn't just digging into one little issue, right? It's trying to provide this broad scope, etc. I think those things. I think that just kind of goes with the territory. That it would be very, very difficult to write a popularized version of history that presents all arguments in both directions. But maybe she leaves some footnotes out that would be good discussion points of why, look, I took this stance, but other people have taken this one, etc. So I didn't. One of the issues, and this has to do with footnoting style. We have the expected tons of endnotes, etc. to something like this. There was a period a little earlier than this when it was common in this kind of book for those to be, and I think it's actually, was it? I don't know. Where it was common to put footnotes at the bottom of the page instead of a set of endnotes at the back of the book. As someone who likes having access to those issues, to whatever issues are being raised, if it's important enough, if it's important enough to have some words about it, and I don't know if there's any that are relatively large. I don't see a hell of a lot of discussion here. I see some, though, although the idea of Chinese origin is still being repeated. I think that's for the plague. Yeah, I mean, it's just a personal taste thing, but if there's anything of interest to be said, and, it's not just a reference to another work, I really want those notes on the same page. I want to see the argument right there. And I really, really dislike whatever period and whatever stylistic guide moved it all to the end notes. It's essentially useless at the end notes. So much more useful in the footnote. In terms of the era that it covered, this was a particularly interesting sort of juncture, not quite the modern age, still in the medieval era, but at a point where things, where the modern age is being ushered in the and here it's largely the depopulation, which is not just the Black Death, which was humongous. You know, some estimates are what half of Europe's population. It's something like 45% of the world population were wiped out by it alone. But also that the warfare, the breakdown of the systems, the fact that like that depopulation itself actually ends up inspiring more wars, in the sense that like the now more valuable laborers are rising up and, fighting for their rights, essentially. Uh, so you're beginning to see the rise of the middle class. And, you're beginning to see it already before this, to some extent, like the Flemish wool merchants and the Italian city states and whatnot, where um, it wasn't just the squalid poor and the knightly classes and whatnot. Uh, but it is a particularly interesting period to take a look at, and I found the one thing that this is focused enough, unlike Heart of Europe, which wandered all over the fucking place. This is focused enough, and it's presented in a um, chronological order for the most part. So it's something you can get your grasp around. I found Heart of Europe was just so painful because it was jumping, okay, let's talk about politics. Now let's talk about economics and everything. Everything was kind of weaved in here, although maybe, not to the same amount of detail. We're looking more at still the great movers and shakers for the most part. Anything else that's discussed is discussed just kind of like, yeah, it sucked to be a peasant, with very, very little investigation into that. While a lot of the more modern archaeology and history has been focusing more on the common man than this does. Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it. I had read it before. In fact, that's how I confused the two books. But alas, my copy went with my first wife, along with most of my books. I don't know that I don't think I gave it to her. I don't know. Maybe I've got a copy of at the barn, but I don't remember. Um, Certainly don't remember having it kicking around. Cornerstone, I know I gave to her, and I kind of am sad about that because that was an interesting one. Done in a similar, like, again, it focused on somebody that we had a lot of information about, but then it made a historical fiction and filled in a lot of the gaps, and kind of like something that say covers Robert E. Lee's life, but is adding all kinds of novelistic and fictional elements. Anyway, I'm gonna load this up. I don't know how much use these book discussions are, but I feel like they're of some value somewhere. People watch them. Some people do. and I can finally get to a book that was loaned to me quite a while ago. I've been waiting to finish this, which should take a lot less time, I hope.